right, welcome to session 3. This is going to be a little bit different. I was listening to my live recording that I did at the beginning of January, and it was an honest to God snooze fest. It just really wasn't that good. So I'm going to try again, and hopefully this is just more valuable to you. In starting our session today, what I actually want you to do is I want you to pull out that list that you bring to confession every time and probably say to some degree on repeat. We all have this list. But in order for us to actually take all this information that I'm trying to throw at you in these sessions and make actual changes in our lives, we need to start paying attention to the sins we actually struggle with. Because really, what's the point of learning about virtue if we're not actually starting to grow in virtue? And so this session, I'm going to be throwing information at you again, but we're going to start taking time to actually pay attention to your specific experience. And I want you to start actually reflecting on that experience itself and start to ask God's grace into that as well. Because this is a little known fact, but the fact that you even know or recognize that something is a sin is a grace. One of the effects of sin is blindness, which means that we are incapable of knowing our own sins without God's grace. And so the fact that you know that whatever it is you're doing or whatever's on that list is a sin is in and of itself a huge and massive grace from God. So we can actually just start right there by saying, thank you, Lord. Thank you for the awareness. And now we can start diving into maybe actually and intentionally moving away from this sin. Now, one of the things that I think really needs to happen if you're really serious about overcoming habitual sin is you need to change the way you respond to habitual sin. More often than not, we feel a lot of shame towards our habitual sin or frustration towards our habitual sin. How many times have you basically told yourself, oh, I can't believe I'm still struggling with this. I can't believe I'm saying it again, or you almost don't even want to go to confession because why? Like, I'm just going to say the same thing and the priest knows that I'm saying the same thing and he's not going to think I'm serious or whatever else. Like these scripts, these thoughts, these conversations we have with ourselves in our heads on repeat, they're actually one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest roadblocks that we have to actually overcoming those same sins. And here's the reason why. Shame, although shame is really good and is really healthy in a healthy amount, like anything else, virtue is not in the excess or the defect, but in the balance, in the mean of it, right? Shame is what keeps your clothes on when you're in public. Shame is good. But when we experience too much, an excessiveness of shame, we can actually start to hide when that's not what's best. And that's what happens when we experience shame towards our sin. We hide, we turn away from it. We want to blind ourselves from it. We don't want to look at it. But until we actually take time to examine what's going on, we'll never actually be able to be freed from that because we'll never fully understand it. So here's the way I want you to start looking at sin and the way I want you to start thinking about sin. We know that the will is made for good. Basically, the will is designed to unite itself to God. That's how it's been designed, right? And the intellect is designed to know God. So to know God and to love God. These are two of the main things we talk about a lot, and you're going to hear that in the catechism, to know him and to love him. And our sin is ultimately where some of these things aren't quite going right, where we're not knowing him 100% or we're not loving him 100%. And so sin is ultimately, to me, an opportunity to know God more and to love him more. Sin is an arrow that points me in the direction of where I haven't yet invited God in. where I haven't yet asked for his healing, where I haven't yet fully surrendered and fully united myself to him. And like I said in session 2, spiritual joy is what we experience when we are united to the good. And so where there is sin, there's actually great capacity for joy. But before that sin can become eradicated in our lives, we have to learn to examine it. We have to start paying attention to it. And that's what I want you to start doing today. So that's why I want you to pull out that list of habitual sins. And I want you to think, which one's having the most negative impact in your life right now? Which one's really kind of weighing you down or causing you a lot of frustration or causing you a lot of shame or just causing you a lot of pain maybe in your relationships? That's the one that I want you to focus on today. And you can focus on one or two, it's totally up to you. And you can write down the questions that I ask you as we go through this video as well, because you can go back and use these same questions over and over and over. They can become a part of that examination of conscience that you do. So the first thing I want us to look at when it comes to examining our sins is our will, how we actually come to make free choice, because that's ultimately in a big way where sin actually takes place, because nothing's really a sin until our volition takes place, until we willfully choose something. But free choice, and this is a common misconception, I think, or just a lack of information. I didn't actually know this myself. I remember learning this not that long ago and being really surprised. But the will does more than just choose. Before we actually make that free choice, there's a lot of back and forth that happens between the will and the intellect. And for me, it seems like this whole conversation that they're having. And basically the intellect takes an object or an end that's kind of been presented to it, looks at it, and judges it to be good, let's say. So the first thing, that's what we call apprehension. And so apprehension is basically the intellect taking this thing and presenting it to the will and saying, hey, look at this. Look at this cool thing that I have. Then the will, and it's a little silly, but the will wills it. So the will desires it, but we call it will. So the will desires this good thing. But before it chooses it, there's still more that needs to happen. The first question that the will, you could say, asks the intellect is this possible? Right? We can desire things, but unless it's possible, we're not going to actually move towards it, are we? Like, one of the things that I would personally love is exploring the entire universe. Walking on planets that I've never been in and just exploring God's creation through the universe. But do I believe that's possible? No, I really don't believe that that's possible. So I'm not spending any time or any energy moving towards this desire because it's not possible. So that second question, that second judgment that the intellect makes is whether or not something is possible. So it kind of judges a universal good, and then it judges whether or not something is possible. And once the will knows whether or not it's possible based on the intellect's judgment, then it decides whether or not it wants to actually set an intention towards that object or that end, right? So that's when we decide whether or not we actually want to focus our energy towards moving towards something. So maybe when you were in high school, let's say you probably were asked a million times, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? Maybe you had a dream of becoming a doctor. And so you set your intention towards becoming a doctor. And what that means is you started to look at how you would go about doing that, how you would go about becoming a doctor. So that's the next question that the will asks the intellect is, well, how would we go about doing that? Right? So again, we've got apprehension. Oh, look at this cool thing. The will goes, yeah, that is pretty cool. Is it possible? Then the intellect goes, yeah, I think it's possible. And the will goes, okay, well, that's awesome. How do we go about doing it? So then the intellect does what we call the act of counsel, which is where it looks at all of the different possibilities or all of the different ways that you could go about doing something, right? So let's say for that example with wanting to become a doctor, you would look at how many years do I need to go to school? What kind of grades do I need to graduate high school with in order to be able to be accepted into my undergrad, right? What schools could I possibly go to? How much money is it going to cost, right? You start looking at all of the different things. So then the intellect brings all of those options over to the will and he goes, well, look at all these possibilities. And the will might decide that there are certain ones it really doesn't want, maybe because there's a lot of bad or evil in them. And so it kind of goes, oh, we'll do away with those, but I like this set. But ultimately, the question of which one is best, that's thrown back to the intellect. And this is its final judgment, right? So we have apprehension, first judgment, then we have counsel, and then we have the second judgment, which means is the best means to pursue the end. And once it makes that decision on which one is best, it presents it to the will. And this is where free choice happens. So there's a lot, right? There's a lot that happens before free choice, or what we might call election, happens. And what does that mean? Well, we know that the will is dependent on the intellect's ability to make good judgments in order for it to choose the right thing. So we need to make right judgment if we want to choose a real good. If we're choosing sin, a lot of the times we think, oh, there's something wrong with my will. Well, there might be through habituation, but ultimately that error first came from the intellect. So it's our intellect that went a little bit faulty in one of those 4 areas, right? Maybe it judged something to be good when it really wasn't. Or maybe it thought something was impossible when it actually wasn't, when it was actually possible. Like becoming a saint, right? We need to believe that becoming a saint is possible before we'll pursue that, before we'll put any time or energy towards actually trying to become a saint, right? Maybe the intellect didn't take enough time and didn't actually look at all the possible means to get to an end. And so it wasn't able to choose the best end because of that. Now, there are three main things that kind of happens to the intellect and in the ways that it goes faulty. And all 3 of these things in a big way originate from our flesh. So they originate from that passive intellect, right? Because we learned this in session 2. The intellect's ability to make a good judgment is extremely dependent on the information that's in the imagination, right? And our passive intellect is what prepares that image in the imagination. Our intellect can become impeded or like bound, right? Where basically something else that's happening that's stopping it from doing its job properly. One of the other things that can happen with the intellect is we actually either over exaggerate something or minimize something. So how many times have we minimized an evil or minimized a sin, saying to ourselves, oh, well, it's not a really bad one. It's not a big deal. We're minimizing the evil, right? Because when that's one of the ways that we can convince the will to choose sin is when we minimize the evil and present that good option. One of the other things that can happen is the will or the intellect can be misinformed, right? So it's been given bad information. So if the information it gets is rotten, well, it's not going to be able to make a good judgment. So let's take a look now again at that passive intellect. And I spent a lot of time on the passive intellect in our last session, in session 2. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going back over the senses and all that kind of stuff. But what I do want to pay attention to, what I do want to draw your attention to is that cogitative power. I didn't talk a lot about the cogitative power in session 2 because I was waiting on purpose to talk about it today in this session because it's so critical. Because your cogitative power is what makes those basic judgments. So whatever basic judgments you make with your cogitative power, that's ultimately what your intellect is going to be dependent on as far as whether or not something is good or bad. So understanding how we go about making those smaller basic judgments in the flesh, huge piece or huge part of being able to understand how it is we go about choosing sin, even though we know it's evil. And I don't think I mentioned this before, and it is important. What happens ultimately, even though we know that something is evil, right? Because how can the will that supposedly only chooses what is good, how can it choose a sin when you know it's evil? What happens is the intellect actually changes it or presents it to the will under the aspect of the good. God is the only thing that is purely 100% good, right? That has absolutely no bad or evil in it in any way. So with every object, every action that is presented to us, there's always a little bit of both. And our intellect has to kind of work through that. And what happens is the intellect will focus on the good and will present it to the will in that way. And so one of the things it'll do is minimize the evil, right? The other thing it'll do is just ignore it completely. How many times I'm laughing because I have done this so many times where I'm just not going to think about that. You look at that delicious bowl of ice cream and you're really full and you probably really shouldn't eat it. And there's all kinds of different negative consequences that might come from eating this delicious bowl of ice cream, but you just ignore that. You just pop it over to the side and just stop thinking about it in order to convince your will to go ahead and eat that bowl of ice cream, right? So we oftentimes will ignore what the evil is and we'll actually just stop thinking about it so that the will can freely choose that good thing that we ultimately want. So let's go back again, that cogitative power. There are three things. It's really basic. There are three things that your cogitative power looks for before it will judge something as good. So it will judge something as good if it is delightful, if it brings us pleasure. So that's one of the basic ones. The other thing it will do is it will judge something as good if it protects you from harm or protects you from suffering, right? If it keeps you from hurting. Now, if you're struggling to engage in an exercise routine, this might be your cogitative power, which sees exercise as harmful because it causes pain. Maybe it's a lot of work or it's going to make you kind of sore the next day. And if you've associated that pain as an evil or as a bad thing, right? Because your cogitative power goes, oh, that was not delightful. Then it goes, exercise is not any good. And so it's going to be really hard for you to choose to do exercise because your cogitative power went, oh no, that's bad, right? So if it protects you from harm, that's the second one. And the third one is if it's useful, or the word I like to use is convenient. And the way I want you to think about this is if something helps you get somewhere faster and easier. So just think of Staples and their big easy button that they've got. That's the third thing that your cogitative power is looking for. Is it convenient? Does it help me get to that good thing faster? Or does it make my life easier in some way, right? Like just think of everything that is convenient and how easy it is to choose something because it's convenient, right? Like ordering online or going and eating out or ordering fast food, having things delivered to you at your door. You like quick fixes. That's your cogitative power that's kicking in, and that's actually ruling your intellect a little bit. So those three things. So take a look at that list again. Pull out those sins that you commit on a regular basis and ask yourself, what aspect of the good am I being drawn to here? Is it delight, right? Is it self-protection? Is it protecting me from harm? Or is it convenience? Or is it a mixture of the three, right? If you grew up in a really traumatic home, where there was a lot of harm that was constantly kind of being done, yelling, abuse, that kind of stuff, your cogitative power, like your whole body is just going to be constantly assessing for threats. You're constantly going to be going, is that going to protect me from harm? So that self-protection mechanism is going to be in high gear, and it's going to influence your capacity to make right judgment. And so these are the three basic things. Now, along with kind of checking in and seeing which one of those three things is ultimately the good that our intellect is presenting to our will, what we want to pay attention to as well is what evil am I potentially ignoring and or minimizing, because it presents an evil in the aspect of the good. So we want to pay attention to what's the aspect of the good that I'm choosing, but we also want to make sure that we're no longer ignoring and or minimizing the evil, because that's going to help balance that out so that it's going to make it easier for our will to stop choosing that sin. If we stop ignoring the evil, it's going to be almost impossible for our will to actually start to choose that. Now, do keep in mind, when your will has become habituated to choosing an evil, right, there's going to be all kinds of extra work that needs to go along with that. Extra graces, asking God's graces into that. Huge, so important. Please don't forget to ask God's help in removing sins in your life. He's your best guy. He actually really wants that to happen. He will help you. Just ask. But that's another thing that we need to ask ourselves. So what three things, and then what's the evil? What's the evil that I'm maybe ignoring? The other thing we want to understand or pay attention to is, am I exaggerating anything or am I minimizing? Our emotions, our passions, the movements of the appetites, they pull us more often than not, they will pull us away from reality or away from truth. The example that comes to mind for me is the dishes. Can you tell that I really struggle with doing my dishes every single day? I'm working on it and I'm getting a lot better. But I mean, the amount of times that I have walked to my dishes, at the end of the day, I'm tired. And because I'm tired and my body is kind of just like is not properly disposed, I look at this pile of dishes on my counter and I think to myself, oh, it's going to take forever. Oh, like that's so much work. It actually only takes about 10 minutes to do. But I'm exaggerating the amount of work that's actually going to take. You can do this with food a lot of the times too when fasting. Oh my gosh, fasting is going to be so hard. Like, I don't think I can do it. We can exaggerate, right? Because yes, there are probably moments in the day where fasting is like really hard. You're maybe a little dizzy. You're really hungry. You're feeling a little cranky. But the matter of fact is, anybody who's fasted for the whole day and who's really like pushed through that, those are moments. It's not like that the whole day. And so again, we exaggerate how bad something is going to be. We can also minimize, again, and I talked about this a little bit, how bad something is going to be, right? And the amount of times I have, again, walked up to my dishes and kind of went, oh, like it's not a big deal if I don't do those right now. There's something else that's more important for me to do. And so I'll just stop thinking about that, or it's not a big deal. We want to be paying attention to whether or not we're exaggerating and or minimizing something whenever we're choosing that habitual sin all the time. We want to get connected to reality, to the truth, because truth is a person. Jesus said it, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So we want to connect ourselves to the truth because we want to connect ourselves to Christ himself. And so we want to stop exaggerating and minimizing. So ask his help in that, right? Because that's really the key here. Self-examination obviously is a really big piece in overcoming habitual sin and starting to understand where the flesh is maybe binding the intellect and stopping it from doing a good job and influencing, right, the will to choose something that's really not actually something that's good. But the simplest thing I can honestly tell you to do is spend time with Jesus. If your intellect is designed to know Christ, to know God, to know truth, the more you get to know Jesus as a person, the more you build a relationship with him, the more you get to know and contemplate the different aspects of who he is and the way he has revealed himself, the stronger your intellect becomes, the more acute your intellect becomes, right? Because the more you come to know truth itself, and the more you know truth, the easier it is to judge what is actually good, what is a real good. And when you judge what is a real good, your will naturally wants that and naturally flows from this. This is why the Catholic Church keeps teaching like relationship first. You have to know God. You have to encounter him. You have to receive him. This is the key. And so all sin does is tells us where we haven't yet encountered God, where we haven't yet encountered Christ. So for me, sin is just an invitation to intimacy with God, an invitation to give yet another piece of my heart and another part of myself to him, to unite myself to him. And like I said in my last session, what is spiritual joy? Spiritual joy is when we become united to a spiritual good, when we become united to God. So the more we experience union with God, the more we experience spiritual joy. So sin really is just like this big beacon of an opportunity to experience union and joy, more joy to be found in that place. When we go there and encounter Christ, we invite him into it. And that takes time. You need to spend time in self-examination, and you need to spend time in prayer. If you're really, really serious about wanting to grow in virtue, about wanting to grow in holiness, and about wanting to kind of kick those habits, those bad habits out of your life, it starts with prayer. It starts with that daily relationship with Christ himself. And that self-examination is a prayer. And it's an invitation for God to come in and to reveal yourself to you and reveal himself to you. That's growing in humility. It's knowing who you are and knowing who God is and living freely in that. Let's just wrap up today's session. We have the will, which is where we have all of our free choice. But what we've come to understand a little bit today is that free choice is not so simple. There's a lot of back and forth that happens between the will and the intellect, which basically means there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of places where the intellect can go a little bit wacky, a little bit faulty on us, which is why we end up choosing evil in the first place. So of course, once we habituate our will to choosing evil, right, that becomes easier and easier when we become more and more inclined towards that. But it always originates with a faulty judgment and a faulty intellect. And our intellect is dependent on our passive intellect, which is the information that we hold in the imagination. And a big part of that is that cogitative power. And our judgment, the judgments of the flesh as to whether or not something is delightful, whether or not something is convenient and or easy, whether or not something is helping to protect us from harm, keeping us from suffering. So whenever we're trying to examine sin and why it is we are able to choose that sin, even though we know it's an evil, we need to start to look at what aspect of the good, how is our intellect presenting this thing to the will in a way that seems good? Is it the delight? Is it the ease and convenience? And or is it self-protection? Is it protecting me from some kind of harm? And we need to ask ourselves again, what's the evil that's hiding in there? The evil that's maybe that I'm ignoring and or minimizing. And we also want to ask ourselves is, are we in touch with reality? Are my emotions impacting the way that I see the issue? Am I exaggerating and or minimizing anything because of how I feel? So those are the main questions that we need to start asking ourselves. The next session, and I love this stuff. Okay, this next session is probably like my absolute favorite. We're going to start actually diving into each individual emotion and or passion. And to me, this is probably one of the biggest like eye openers when it comes to why we do what we do or why we struggle so much. Because all of our emotions are ultimately responses to our cogitative power. So whenever we've made one of those basic judgments that I talked about today, there's an emotional response that happens. There's a passion that happens, a movement of the appetites. And so it can be really hard to get down. It can actually be really, really difficult to get down to the roots of the associations and or judgments, which in psychology we call like subconscious beliefs, right? So those are rewiring and all of that stuff that we talk about in psychology. That's your cogitative power mostly that's happening that we're talking about there. And that can be so deep because, and I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. Those associations that you build in your cogitative power, associations are basically just basic judgments that you've made over and over and over and over again. Those associations, most of them, about 90 to 95% of them are actually developed before you hit the age of 7. So unless you have like intentionally developed your own moral life and your own ideas and intentionally like dug back deep into those childhood associations and beliefs and judgments that you have made before the age of 7, you are likely living most of your life out of those beliefs. And I know it's cliche, but that's one of the reasons that in psychology we are always going back to your childhood. It's because it has a huge impact on everything that you do in the future and your relationships and how you see the world. And so paying attention to those cogitative powers, those judgments, is so difficult. So our emotions become really, really useful because, like I said, they're a response to the judgment. So if we understand how a certain judgment can cause a certain emotional response, then paying attention to our emotions, it's usually a lot easier to notice how it is we're feeling than it is to figure out that subconscious belief that we've got. Our emotions can help us to backtrack. They're like these giant arrows that point us to attachments, to these attachments that we have to the physical world, which are making it difficult for us to choose God. And in that way, we can again invite God into it and start to dismantle those attachments because we're able to judge them properly. We're able to judge them anew because we're bringing them back into our consciousness, into the front of our minds, and allowing our intellect to take a look at it again and reevaluate. So that's our next session. We're going to be going through the 11 Catholic emotions, that's what I call them, by St. Thomas Aquinas. And I think it's going to be amazing and you're going to love it. So super excited to see you there. Until then, God bless.